Go to bed and wait for the Sandman. Even as it came out of James's mouth, it seemed to him like a strange thing to say, and he was not sure why he said it, but for some reason it had worked. Daniel went to bed. The next morning, though, he asked, "What does the Sandman look like?" James was making breakfast. Daniel sat at the table, short legs swinging under his chair. "Nothing really," James said. "It's just an expression." "What does it mean?" "Just something people say." He put up a plate of eggs in front of Daniel and kissed him on top of his head. He thought that would be the end of it. That was until he saw the Sandman for himself. He was getting ready for bed, and stopped by Daniel's room to check on him while he slept, as he often did. It was such a routine precaution that when he saw the pale, naked man sitting on the edge of Daniel's bed, rocking back and forth, it took a moment to process what he was saying. He reacted the way any father would, of course. He ran into the room screaming, and for a moment he thought about attacking the intruder, but the man in the bed turned, and that's when James saw it. It wasn't really a man. It was a pale, slithering thing, hairless and warped. Its joints turned all the wrong ways, and its body out of shape with itself. When it moved, it was like an insane marionette dancing on stage. James froze. The skittering thing watched him. He felt spreading warmth that he realised he had just pissed his pants. Only when he remembered that Daniel was still lying there on the bed, staring at the broken-shaped thing sitting a foot away, did he regain the courage to move. He grabbed Daniel and ran. In the hall he turned to see if the thing would follow them, but it didn't. For a moment it watched them, and then, moving like a stop-motion nightmare, it crawled out the window and jumped, leaving only billowing curtains to mark its passing. James had trouble talking to the police about what he had saw. He reported a break-in, but when he was asked to describe the intruder, he didn't know what to say. How could he make the ordinary man in the blue uniform sitting at his kitchen table while his two colleagues searched the house understand a thing that he had seen? He couldn't even understand it himself. To make matters worse, Daniel's memory didn't correspond to James's. He described an ordinary-looking burglar. "A man in a mask," he said. James thought about it. Had it been a mask? No, it would have to be a full-body costume, and an elaborate one at that. Something they would use for a movie, and that wouldn't even explain the way it moved. But at the end, he just simply echoed his son's testimony. "A man in a mask," he said. A burglar." The lie unsettled him almost as much as what had happened. The doctor said Daniel wasn't hurt and showed no signs of molestation. James was relieved. They stayed at a motel for a couple of nights until they felt ready to come home, and then James had a new security system installed alongside with bars on his windows. He didn't like the sight of them in Daniel's room, but it seemed like the only thing to do. James was frightened that first night back in the house, but Daniel, strangely, was not. When asked if he felt okay sleeping alone, he just said yes. In the end, it was James who found himself wishing he weren't sleeping alone. He was up all night listening for the sound of anything moving in the house. Although he'd convinced himself that his memory was faulty, and that it had been a normal, albeit probably deeply disturbed, man in his son's room, when he closed his eyes even for a second he pictured bloodless skin and a twisted, inhuman face. He found himself wondering, why my house, why my family? He of course knew there didn't have to be a reason, but he still wondered. 2 weeks later, Daniel stopped talking. James didn't notice it at first. Kids went through quiet phases sometimes, but eventually he tried to get Daniel to talk and he wouldn't. Eventually it became clear that he couldn't. Back to the doctor they went. "Nothing wrong with him that we can see," was the diagnosis. "Was it the trauma?" James asked. "Could be," they said. "Sometimes these things come on late. Children can be a mystery, even to those who knew them the best." They recommended a child psychologist whom James couldn't afford. He could not even for that matter afford the bill they were giving him right now. Nothing seemed to help. Daniel would write out answers to questions sometimes, but never more than a yes or a no. When James would ask him what was wrong, or if he'd seen or heard anything that had frightened him, Daniel would only stare. He seemed furtive and bemused. James found himself missing the sound of his son's voice. Sometimes he wanted to hear it so bad that he ached. But it seemed that Daniel wouldn't talk again until he was ready. James had other things to worry about too. He was convinced, beyond reason, that the intruder was not really gone. The alarm never went off, and the locks and bars remained undisturbed. He was so sure that he heard movement in the night. Not normal movement, it was like the sound of a huge snake slithering through the house. When he heard it, he imagined horrible things. Nothing was ever there, of course, when he went to investigate, though he often thought that he had glimpsed something out the corner of his eye. A pale, misshapen foot, or a shadow that would slink away as soon as he turned. He rarely slept, and when he did, he had haunted dreams. Soon he realised that he had not left the house in weeks except to go to the bank to buy except to go to the bank and buy groceries. He felt hemmed in. With Daniel acting mute, he hadn't actually had a conversation with anyone in weeks. So he called his mother. The connection was bad and her voice sounded faint, on the verge of not being there at all. "I guess I'm okay, Ma," he said, pausing to wipe the sweat from his palms and make sure that he could hear Daniel playing in the next room. "But things have been a little rough. We had a break-in." "Oh, how awful," Mum said. "Did they take anything?" "Nah, I just ran off. It was weird though, I haven't really felt comfortable since then." "Are you still working at that hospital?" "No, Ma, I left last year, you know that." "Oh, well, have you been getting out? What about that nice woman you were seeing last year? The one who played the piano?" James scowled. She was always asking that type of thing. Didn't she know how hard it was being a single father? That he didn't have the time. He was about to say something when something made him pause. "Ma, is there anyone else on the line?" "I don't think so." James was sure he heard it. Though the short, gasping sound of someone trying to hold their breath and failing. A cold feeling crept across the back of his neck. "You're sure nobody's listening on your other phone?" "Dear, there is no other phone. I'm on the cell. That's why the service is so bad." "Then what is it?" James stopped. If the sound wasn't coming from her end, then... He dropped the phone and raced into the hall. The extension hung on its hook, undisturbed. Heart pounding, he hurtled into the garage. The spare phone was sat on the workbench, no one in sight, but could they have been? Could someone have been here all along, listening to his phone call and slithered away? Might they even be here now? The next day, he took out the extra phone extension and he filled the jacks with rubber cement. Daniel watched him work, eyes curious, but James offered no explanation. He began giving Daniel a light physical exam every week. His CNA training was a little rusty after a year's on disabilities, but you never really forget it. It was an absurd thing to do, of course, even if there was a physical cause for Daniel's behaviour. There would be nothing he could discover this way, and he was aware on some level that it was compulsive behaviour. Nevertheless, it made him feel better. One morning, James set up the diaphragm of the stethoscope against Daniel's chest, but he could not locate a heartbeat. He moved in his hand in search of the right spot, to no avail. Then to test it, he listened to his own heartbeat. It came through, steady and clear. But when he checked Daniel, he didn't hear anything. The thought came unbidden to him of the Tin Man in The Wizard of Oz, whose chest was empty as a kettle. A sick feeling roiled onto his stomach as he threw his stethoscope down on the ground and grabbed Daniel by his shoulders, looking into his face. Daniel stared back with bright eyes. He even smiled a little with the corner of his mouth. James felt a tingle of tears as he swept his son up into his arms and hugged him. And Daniel hugged back. Then James put on his shirt and sent him to play. The stethoscope, he decided, was broken. He threw it into the trash. Things got worse. James's terrors were no longer regulated to the long hours of the night. Now it seemed that some creeping, some skittling, scuttling, some unknowable noise in the dark corner or another filled every second of his day. The thought of how big the house was really started to weigh down on him. There were so many rooms he wasn't in at any given time, so many places someone or something else could be. He imagined strange figures occupying the rest of his home when he wasn't around, melting in the walls or merging with the shadows whenever he turned on a light or opened a door. How would he know if they were there? How would he ever know? Soon he didn't even have to be outside a room to imagine it. When he walked up the stairs, he pictured pale, lurking figures beneath them, and when he went down to a hall, he pictured a crawling thing slithering behind the walls, shadowing his every step. If he sat too long in the same chair, he imagined it was right behind him, and he was never comforted when he turned around and found nothing there. As he could only guess, it had moved swiftly and silently behind him once again, wherever he wasn't looking right now. That's where he imagined it to be. He was losing his mind. He knew the only thing that helped him cling to sanity was Daniel seemed undisturbed. Other than his muteness, his behaviour was perfectly normal. And whenever he seemed to sense that his father was troubled, he would hug him or squeeze his hand or even smile. Sometimes when he left the room, James cried. One night he found himself creeping around the house with no lights on at 2 o'clock in the morning. If the intruding thing had taken to violating his daytime activities, then he would get revenge by confronting it on his own terms, the night. And really, night was no more frightening than day to him at this point. They were almost interchangeable. He padded barefoot down the halls and up the stairs, in and out of the disused rooms, and sometimes he stopped to listen, hoping to locate it by sound. It was a stealthy, creeping thing he knew, but it was awkward at times, and it couldn't always keep its strangely shaped limbs from making their distinct, irregular footsteps. The smallest noise would give it away. There was one room he respected it he suspected it spent most of his time in the spare bedroom. Not really a bedroom at all, really. More like a closet, just large enough to accommodate a bed if one was so inclined. It was unpainted, uncarpeted, drafty. He always meant to fix it up, but he didn't come here often because he disliked the bare, unused look of it. It made him think partially of a disarranged corpse. He came in now, though. If a thing made its nest anywhere in the house, this was where it would be. Of course, there was nothing here now, but that didn't mean there would be nothing there. He cursed, running a hand through his swept, damp hair. What was he missing? How did it hide from him? What was its secret? He peered into the room's empty corners one by one, getting his face a few inches from the plaster and the floorboards so they could be certain that there was no place for it to conceal itself. The light bulb flickered, and he froze. My God, he thought. It's on the ceiling. He pictured it crawling above him, like a huge pale lizard. That's how it gets around, he thought. That's how it escapes any time I should have it cornered. It just scuttles up the wall and hides right above my head. He imagined it dangling down behind him like a spider. If I turn around, he thought, it'll be there, hanging with its face right next to mine. He held his breath. He did not want to turn around, but he had no choice. It was between him and the door. With a quiet sob, he rounded on his heels. Of course, he was alone. There was no man on the ceiling. He checked twice. Maybe it crawled out and was waiting for him in the hall, but when he checked, the coast was clear once again. It should have been a relief, but it was not. After all, it had to be here somewhere. If the ceiling was not his trick, then that just meant it was somewhere else, somewhere even more strange, even more clever. He went in Daniel's room. He had not stopped checking on him at night, like he always had. This time, though, rather than opening the door, he listened first, pressing each ear against the cheap grain of wood. What? No. And holding his breath, terrified that he would hear a skittling sound on the other side of the barrier. What he heard shocked him even more, however. Daniel was talking to someone. James recoiled for a second, and then, when he caught his breath, he kicked the door in. Daniel was already awake, indeed, sitting up in his bed, but he wasn't saying anything now. The light flashed on, and James stalked the hallway before stopping suddenly torn. What did he want more, to confirm that his son could speak again, or to find whomever he was speaking to? The creak of the door hinge settled that matter for him. He ran to the closet and threw it open. There was nothing inside, or at least nothing that shouldn't be there. He swept aside the clothes on their hangers, but nothing was hiding between them. Then he dragged the toy box and emptied it to the floor. Nothing. He combed along the bare walls and floor, yes, even the ceiling, pushing aside every last bit of rubbish and stray knickknacks so that he could be sure, absolutely sure, that nothing was hiding there. All the while, Daniel watched him. After a few minutes, James was panting, covered in sweat. The closet was bare, and there was neither no intruders or answers inside. It struck him as funny, somehow. He started to laugh, very quietly, and then kicked his son's toys out the way and went to sit next to him on the bed. Dazed, he became aware all at once of several things. First being that he had not slept in days, and was nowhere near in his right mind. The second of how close he had really come to losing it, for good. Tomorrow he decided that they would both sleep until the afternoon, and when they did wake up, he and Daniel would get out of this creaky old house. No more staying cooped up like prisoners, and no more checkups, and no more dreams about monsters. He would even take the bars off the windows. It was time to get back to living like real people again. It was time to... James saw it when he brushed his hand through Daniel's hair. He pulled Daniel a little too roughly closer. His son acquiesced to the examination, without fidgeting or complaint, as James pawed the side of his head, hoping that what he was seeing would somehow stop it from being apparent. He stared and stared until he ached from not blinking, when there was no denying what was right in front of his eyes. Daniel was missing an ear. No, he realised with mounting nausea, both ears. There was no injury, no incision where the mark should have been, just simply smooth, blank flesh, as blank as Daniel's quiet, undisturbed demeanour. James swept him up into his arms and raced into the hall. He was not sure where he was going or what he meant to do when he got out there. He just knew that there was nothing more important than getting his son out of that house, but their path was cut off. A naked man sat in the hallway, with his back to them. No, not a man. James recognised the stretched limbs and stooped shoulders. The pale thing squatted on its haunches, rocking back and forth like it was palsied. It almost seemed to be in pain. James hugged his son closer and backed away when he heard Daniel's voice. Daddy? James turned to Daniel, and then he heard the voice again. Daddy? But Daniel's lips hadn't moved. James looked at the back of the hunched figures, and then its head jerked and when it talked like a tick. Hello, Daddy. James's mouth went dry. It took several times before he could speak. Don't call me that. It is the voice's name for you. Go away, leave my family alone. But I am your family. The longer it talked, the more its voice became distorted and blurred. An icy feeling nested inside James's stomach. Who are you? Someone who came to visit. Why here? You invited me. James's heart thudded against the inside of his chest. Why? I had something you wanted. James licked at his dry lips. You're lying, you don't have anything I want. I want you to leave. Leave and never come back. Who is Daniel's mother? James blinked. What? Who is Daniel's mother? What kind of question is that? How old is Daniel? James blinked again. The thing's voice caused a pitching pain in the center of his forehead. Stop asking me these things. When is Daniel's birthday? I don't know. What is his middle name? Shut up! What was his first word? I said shut up! James wanted to tear the thing apart with his bare hands. Only the heaviness of Daniel in his arms kept him where he was. You were alone, and you wanted a son, so I made one for you. James's hand began to shake. That doesn't make sense. Made out of what? Out of myself. James's stomach turned over. But now I need those parts back. Daniel picked at James's shoulder to get his attention. Something was strange about Daniel's face. Danny, open your eyes. Daniel scrunched his eyes tighter. Open your eyes, Danny. Danny, open your eyes. Open your eyes. Daniel shook his head, trying to refuse, but he couldn't hold it forever. Eventually, his eyelids flickered open, and James saw the truth. Daniel's eyes were gone. James almost dropped him for a second. He wanted to throw his son down so he could stop looking into those empty holes that occupied his face. Daniel opened his mouth as if to speak, but of course he had no voice. He is coming back to be a part of me again. No, give him back. I cannot. It has been too long. I warned you this would happen. You're lying, you're such a goddamn liar. Give me my son back. I do not lie. I warned you he could not exist forever, but you do not remember. You can only remember what I want you to. You forget all the times we have talked. Daniel felt like a doll, or an empty bag. His hair was falling out, disappearing before it touched the ground. His hands vanished into his sleeves, and his feet rolled up inside his pants cuffs. James cradled the tiny baby, the tiny, shapeless thing. Tears streamed down his face. Soon he held a pile of empty clothes, and then those two were gone. He looked around the house. Toys disappeared, photos vanished from their frames. Daniel's little shoes were no longer by the door. James turned over at Daniel's room, was confronted by a wall where a door should have been. He groped at the blank surface, fingertips scrambling. He hit his head against the wall, but the pain didn't feel real. Why did you do this? It was what you wanted, and I learned so much. This is impossible. People will ask. People will wonder, the police, the hospitals, the people in the neighborhood. They have already forgotten him. They will only remember what I want them to. Like you. James pressed his hands to his aching soul. Will I at least remember him after this? You can try, but your mind will fail you, now that everything he was is a part of me again. James sat on the floor, looking at the blank wall. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw the thing creep towards him, and even felt its wet hand on his shoulder, but he did not look at it. If I won't remember any of this, then why tell me? He said. Because a father should know. And then James was alone. Abigail worried about James sometimes. When they met a year ago, he said that he had never been married, never had kids, but there was a certain pained expression when he assumed... But there was a certain pained expression. He assumed when he said the last part. Abigail knew that look. She had met parents who had lost children before. You learned to recognise it. And there were other things about him that worried her too. Sometimes she would find him staring at a particular spot on the wall, brow furrowed in concentration. He did not seem to realise he was doing it, but of course there was the insomnia and the sleepwalking to consider too. Yes, there was lots of worry about, but she loved him all the same. James still said he never had kids, and neither had she. She'd long wanted to, but it was impossible. She worried that James wouldn't stay with a woman who couldn't be a mother, though he constantly assured her that that was not so. There were times, more and more often, that there were nights where James took to sleepwalking, and even Abigail imagined she heard strange scuttling noises in the house and saw impossible shapes in the dark corners. When she thought she would do anything, absolutely anything if it meant having a little daughter for she and James to raise, at those moments she became truly afraid, and she never knew why.